travels with Pevsner to Norfolk.
Between 1949 and 1974, Professor Nicholas Pevsner, a German émigré art historian, toured the counties of England, compiling a 46-volume guide to every building he thought was of interest, from Stonehenge to Centre Point.
What's happened to that tower? That upper part is sitting at an angle on the bottom.
Pevsner's guides, regularly updated, are unique. Nothing quite like them exists anywhere else in the world.
Well, now for Barrow. Mind that dog.
In this series, 6 contemporary travellers take to the road, with Pevsner's Buildings of England as their guide.
Norfolk is an exposed county, but it is also a curiously secluded one, with many stretches and patches so remote and unvisited that one cannot believe one is only 100 miles from London. With the Wash and the Fens on one side and the North Sea on the other too, Norfolk seems only just able to keep above water. And there can be very little difference between the exposed surface of the county and the invisible sea floor beyond its coasts.
Norfolk awoke in me the love of buildings. It is full of wonderful, often secret places that challenge all my ideas about the past and about the present. And Norfolk has, so far, escaped the heritage merchants and their particular brand of ghastly good taste. So my journey through a landscape where history is more tangible, more real than anywhere else I know, and the modern has also made its mark. Here there exists a more dramatic relationship between architecture and landscape than anywhere else in England. As though God created Norfolk as a fine blank canvas on which man could make his own mark, unrivaled by natural obstacles. The approach to Holkham Hall is a rare and sublime experience. Here man makes his monumental mark, 2 miles slashed across the Norfolk canvas. At its focus sits one of the most extraordinary 18th century houses in England. Nicholas Pevsner considered it more of a palace than a house.
Holkham Hall, seat of the Earls of Leicester. The foundation stone was laid in 1734. In plan, Holkham is a centre block connected by straight links to 4 oblong wings. The style is Palladian, rusticated basement with small windows, a superb piano nobile, first floor, 4 square angle turrets or eminences, each with 1 small window and a pyramid roof. A portico of 6 Corinthian columns carrying a pediment.
The designers of Holkham, Lord Burlington and William Kent, were firm believers in the theories of the late 16th century Italian architect Andrea Palladio. Now, Palladio had argued that the ancient Greeks, through a process of trial and error, through observation of nature, had found the key to beauty. In other words, they knew how God made things beautiful. Burlington and Kent wanted to apply those laws here in Norfolk. These immutable laws of beauty boil down to one core idea: the use of primary geometrical forms, the square, the cube, and the triangle, used in varying proportions. Burlington and Kent believed this made for beautiful buildings and harmonious lives. The austerity of the exterior is not continued inside. This type of plated architecture is meant to reflect the character of the Englishman, grave, extremely proper without, full of passion, even licentious within. So Hokum proclaims its proportion and geometry as God-given, and I believe it. But in Norfolk it wasn't altogether new. All over the county there is elemental geometry, as though across the centuries the landscape has demanded of man this response. Norfolk's round tower churches, wonderful primary cylindrical forms, dominate the landscape still.
St. Margaret Hales, a perfectly preserved Norman village church, round tower. An exceptionally fine north doorway, crisply carved and full of ornamental invention.
The precise origin of the round tower church is a mystery. Why should so many be in Norfolk, 134 in all, and just a handful in the rest of England? Pevsner believes the fashion came from Italy and Germany in the 9th and 10th centuries. And indeed, for most of its history, Norfolk has felt closer to the continent than London. Cut off by perilous forests and tracts of fenland, it was remote, even alien to the rest of England. Norfolk's separateness is threatened, but still tangible today. Free of huge industrial conglomerates and motorway madness, the county feels pre-industrial, even pre-19th century.
St. Mary, Borough St. Peter, West Tower, telescoping brick boxes with pointed windows, probably early 16th century.
Little known and less regarded, St. Mary's looks like a pile of children's building blocks. I love this elemental geometry. The ziggurats at the University of East Anglia, just outside Norwich, are elemental geometry again, but designed in 1962 by Dennis Laston. They were completed too late to be in Pevsner's own Norfolk volume, but how he would have loved them. At the very time these Norfolk volumes were being written in the early 1960s, at the very time all this, the University of East Anglia, was on the drawing board, British architecture was undergoing a dramatic change. Now, Pevsner was in the camp of the modernists. He believed that all great architecture should reflect the spirit of its age. And to him, the spirit of the post-war age was modernism. But, unusually, he also believed that all great buildings are rooted in the past, if only you can see it. So Pevsner sought to reveal the ideas that link all great buildings of all ages, however different the buildings might appear to be. This is a bold attitude to architecture. Putting myself in Pevsner's shoes, I know he would have linked this wonderful building not only with St. Mary's, but with Hokum too. It's that game with geometry again, elemental shapes thrusting out into the landscape. Of course, there are other things going on here as well. The university is a modernist city in miniature. Abstract art as architecture, elevated walkways, and segregation of traffic and pedestrians. But there's sheer bloody-mindedness here as well. Some of this is radical two-finger stuff, challenging our ideas about whether or not architecture ought to be polite. Of course, it isn't just modern buildings that assault the senses. Old buildings constantly shock me. Look at Wymondham Abbey. It sits in the landscape more like an industrial building than a church. In scale, form, even sometimes lack of ornament, old buildings can be rude and shocking. Or they would be if only we could see them as they are, our eyes unshuttered by sentimentality. What could be more cosy than a Georgian vicarage? But this one at Saxlingham, Nethergate, by Sir John Soane, built in 1784, is classical architecture stripped bare of ornament and designed with an arrogant will to dominate the landscape. Austere and radical, even now it sits utterly alien in its amiable rustic context.
St. Peter, Walpole St. Peter. One of the most impressive churches of its date in the county, circa 1350 to 1400. Battlements, all decorated with small-scale motifs, especially panelling. Rood stair turrets with spirelets. The turrets have tiny windows, and that on the north side is externally supported by a little man.
St. Peter may not look like a shocking building, but it certainly is. The medieval parishioners here wanted to parade their wealth and superiority, so the stone is not local, but expensively imported from Rutland, and the construction was utterly modern. Most buildings are held up by their walls, but here the walls are relieved of their structural role. This is the finest engineering of the spiritual age, the Gothic age. And here the walls, no longer having to hold up the building, can be pierced by huge windows to let God's light flood inside. The weight of the nave roof is transferred along the aisle roofs to external buttresses between the windows. This means not only can huge windows be inserted, but there is minimal internal structure. So fine is the balance here, the mass of masonry is overwhelmed by space and light. I love the richness and complexity of this interior. It's certainly far removed from the sort of bleak, sterile box with fitted carpets to which so many trendy vicars and their congregations now aspire. All this furnishing from the 15th, 16th, 17th, even 18th centuries tells us so much about the way the parish church was used, was occupied in the past. Here, ordinary worldly needs are as important as the spiritual. This is a place both sacred and secular, rich and earthy, espousing a vigorous, unprecious Christianity. This interior reminds me that in the past people came close to God through beauty, spirituality achieved through the senses. One of the things I love about Norfolk is that even today so many corners have yet to be explored. Not many counties have so much still hidden, allowing me the rare and delicious pleasure of genuine discovery. There are many fine Elizabethan houses in the county, but none has kept its secrets like Old Hall, South Birmingham.
Old Hall, South Birmingham. The house has a fine Elizabethan porch, red brick, 3 stories in height, and with polygonal angle shafts with round decorated brick finials. The pediment above the first floor window is enriched by 2 rustic figures of mermaids holding a cartouche with a head.
On first appearances, it looks like a modest thatched cottage with an outrageously pretentious porch added on. But just look at the corners of the building. The different coloured bricks at each end were beginnings of a much grander E-plan house, never completed. The exterior of nearby Kirsted Hall reveals what was intended. So instead, Old Hall has dropped unnoticed through history, keeping its rare intact interior a secret until now. A wonderful but miniature version of a grand Elizabethan house. Even Pevsner missed it. To step into its screens passage is to discover a domestic interior of 400 years ago. The screens passage is an early form of corridor. In fact, any corridor this house would have had when it was completed originally. It connects the front door with the back door, divides the family part of the house from the servant part over there. The name is very interesting. Screens passage harks back to the time, 50 years or so before this house was built, when a timber screen was inserted into the great hall where the family would be dining to protect them from the wind and weather when the front doors opened. By this time, things are more sophisticated. The screen is now made out of brick and masonry and plaster. Here's the door to the hall. The great hall is a room with the highest status. No gentleman could be without one. Here the family entertained neighbours' other merchant families. And, as one would expect, the fire surround, very important. And here we have the remains of a very large and ornate fire surround, moulded bricks here, render over it, details that have been here. In the 16th century, staircases were functional rather than ornamental. This is the main staircase of the house, yet it's no more than a set of winders going round, a great timber post rising from the top to bottom of the house. Up on the first floor is the great chamber, the focus of family life in the house, the family sitting room. Once again, a wonderful fire surround, not as big as the one below in the great hall, but nevertheless spectacular. Flattened Tudor arch, wonderful carved spandrels here, and, most incredible of all, original paint. But at the top of the house, above me, is a spectacular room, forgotten since the early 17th century, and now in a desperate state. Every Elizabethan house with pretensions to grandeur had to have a long gallery. Old Hall has a long gallery. This is it, a spectacular space. But like everything about Old Hall, it comes in miniature. Now, to accommodate a room of this size within such a tiny house took some ingenuity. What happens is the gallery stretches from above the porch room there to above the staircase behind me. These sorts of rooms are very important in the 16th and 17th century. They're where the family displayed their wealth, their tapestries, their furniture, their paintings, where they exercised themselves in the winter. This room, in its way, had a very rare and sumptuous scheme of decoration. Such a fine wall painting in a house is a very rare survival. This great hunting scene was probably inspired by Flemish tapestries. No one dreamt it was here.
I screamed, and I'd taken away a piece of plaster, and there was this claw, very clearly defined and drawn. We thought it was probably a unicorn or lion at the time. And as we slowly took away the lime wash, went up the leg. It was just so exciting. We kept going all afternoon, all evening, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
It was the day that Yeltsin stood on the tanks. I remember
That's
that.
true.
The obvious question now is, can the room be saved? Obviously, it's in a desperate state, really.
What did they say, Mark? How much could be recovered
They
from that?
reckon that 70 to 80% is recoverable.
Yet its perilous state is part of its magic now, isn't it? The fact that it's about to collapse.
And of course, as soon as they've uncovered it, in a sense, there's the problem of light destroying it. In a way, the lime wash has preserved it. Once you take the lime wash away, how long will they last? Nobody quite knows the answer to that.
Norfolk is full of mystery too. Even architecturally celebrated buildings have somehow escaped dissection and death by guidebook. When historical facts about a building have become lost in the mists of time, architecture is at its most seductive.
Great Cressingham Priory, a sumptuous brick house circa 1545. Polygonal turrets. A frieze of intersected arches upside down with big leaves, and above this the whole upper floor and the turrets are faced with terracotta panelling. In the panels, small emblems repeating a hand holding a hawk and a wreath with a monogram. Mr. Paget Baggs tells me the monogram is that of John Jenny, who did not come into the property until 1542.
But why is a relatively small house decorated so lavishly and in terracotta in a new and expensive material? Even the name Great Cressingham Priory is misleading, since it never was a priory. And Pevsner's assertion that the house was built in the 1540s is by no means the end of the story. This building is an architectural whodunit. I must turn house detective. The back of the house is later than the front, and inside it's older. Now, this is absolutely fascinating. This timber ceiling, these timbers, date from the early 16th century. That is 150 years before the date of this part of the house, according to the date stone outside, and date stones never lie. These row mouldings, these concave mouldings are all absolutely right for about 1500. These timbers fit together perfectly. These joists go into the beam as intended, very neatly done, very wonderful. This is a proper, authentic early 16th century ceiling. So what is happening? If you go over here, things get even more confusing. I can tell that this was originally an external wall. This diaper pattern was only used outside. Indeed, this pattern survives on exterior walls of this building. This terracotta plinth, again, an exterior detail. And here we have an external window with moulding to throw off rainwater. Glass was placed in there, and the windows continue right up, quite clearly external. So what do we have here? We have something very extraordinary. The whole ceiling is salvaged and moved here very neatly, very sensibly, I guess, in the late 17th century. Some farmer did us a great favour. He preserved and reused a very rare thing, an early 16th century great hall. I say salvage, it's more than salvage, it's virtually the recreation of a most wonderful room of around 1500. But where did it stand originally? And this is it. This is where the Great Hall stood originally, just 25 yards away from its present location, where it was moved in the 17th century by that very decent farmer. How do I know? Well, its foundations are beneath my feet, below me, behind me. And what looks like a pond is in fact the moat, the ancient moat, that surrounds the site, much larger than that occupied by the existing house. The Great Hall itself is now nothing more than a lawn. So now we know. Originally the house was much bigger, and so the sumptuous decoration on the surviving frontage is less surprising. But no one dreamt till now the magnificent decoration might have been even richer. The vital clues have just resurfaced. These fragments of terracotta have recently been dug out of the moat. They tell me some very interesting things about this house. First of all, there are decorative details here that are no longer on the building as it exists. Clearly, the building would originally have been much richer than it is now. For example, this extraordinary fish scale motif here, and this wonderful thing here, sort of cusp, oh good heavens, a fleur-de-lis. Also, you can see that this terracotta is very hard, very good material. This stuff's been underwater for, gosh, 400 years. The mouldings are as crisp as they were the day the thing was new. And this piece is very odd. It has a Tudor footprint here, footprint of a cat. Clearly these things were made in clay and left lined up in the sun. A cat danced across this one. My God, this is pioneering Tudor mass production.
King's Lynn is a delightful little town. The walls remain in various places, including the South Gate. Defoe attributes to it more gentry and gaiety than to Norwich and Yarmouth. It was one of England's busiest ports, serving the Ouse and its tributaries and exporting wool and cloth. The scale of the streets is intimate, and very little has been disturbed by later interference.
How right Pevsner is. To me, this is the most exciting street in Britain, and thankfully untarted up with heritage trappings. It offers a rare vision of the 18th century city. Standing at its heart, one looks out into the green fields beyond, before the suburbs came. Here there is no rude interruption from insensitive 19th and 20th century buildings. Instead, a glorious mix of dates, styles, materials, and uses. This really is one of the most exciting urban experiences, far better even than Bath, in comparison the simple repetition of one idea. The mix here is also of incredible quality. At times, it's as though I'm travelling down a street in Florence, surrounded by merchant palaces.
Clifton House, built 1708, but the facade hides older parts. The portal is decorated with barley sugar columns, a rare thing in England.
The scale and quality of this wonderful staircase reveals just how wealthy and cultured King's Lynn merchants were in the early 18th century. The craftsmanship is outstanding. It's amazing to see something of this quality in a provincial merchant town. A staircase like this wouldn't disgrace a London mansion of 1708. Above the elegant staircase, the faces of early 18th century traders stare down. The people who lived and worked here, warts and all. Refinement and commerce made a natural marriage in 18th century King's Lynn. Behind the front of the house and attached to it stands a huge tower. Built in the 1580s, it rises 6 floors. This view is what King's Lynn is all about. From the 16th and 17th, 18th centuries, merchants would climb to the top of their prospect towers to look out for their ships coming from the North Sea down the Great Ouse. There were once many of these towers in the town. This is the last one to survive. Just along the quay, at the heart of King's Lynn, is one of my favourite buildings in England.
Customs House by Henry Bell, built of stone in 1683 as a merchant's exchange. The building, influenced by the Dutch style, stands on its own by the quay in a most becoming situation.
This is one of the finest 17th century public buildings in Britain. It's quite as good as anything by Wren. In many ways, it's better. Look at the wonderful clarity of its composition. I love the tiers of pilasters and the razor-like sharpness of the detail. Absolutely fantastic. This building, devoted to trade, has all the finesse of a cathedral. The faces on this building tell me so much. A baby Bacchus acknowledges that wine was traded here. A sea god reminds me that wealth came by water. A girlish Flora that corn was also a major commodity. And this glorious turbaned head must be the spirit of commerce herself. The decoration on the customs house can be read like a book, if only you know the language. Old buildings in that respect never die, but stand as powerful monuments to the ideas that created them.
The Hare Chapel, Stow Bardolph, 1624, of brick.
Inside the Hare Chapel, two monuments capture a pivotal moment in Norfolk's architectural history.
Sarah Hare died 1744. She is dressed in her normal clothes. The poor girl died from blood poisoning after having pricked her finger while busy on some needlework.
Wax effigies like Sarah's are incredibly rare. It was made following her own precise instructions left in her will. Through her effigy, she wanted to resurrect the Roman ideal of burial. Her father, Sir Thomas, though more tentative, also embraces the new fashion. He retains his traditional periwig while donning the garb of a Roman general. This was the moment Norfolk became England's Arcadia.
Rainham Hall is the paramount house of its date in Norfolk, 1622. It is also one of the most attractive major houses in the county, warm and comfortable looking in spite of its size. The materials are brick and stone. The two wings, hardly projecting at all, have Dutch gables, a new thing then, a classical portico crowned by a pediment. The oval cartouche in the centre is an accomplished piece that could almost surround the bust on a funeral monument in Rome.
Rainham Hall is one of Norfolk's secret places, rarely seen and never open to the general public. Its magnificent interior is Roman, or at least an 18th century architect's interpretation of the Roman. The design is attributed to William Kent, who worked at Holkham. He was one of the most celebrated architects of his day. But I'm always on the lookout for the architectural underdog. I believe the interior at Rainham is the work of Thomas Ripley, an unsung Norfolk genius. This is the most astonishing room, the dining room. Here we have external architecture brought inside. This is a Roman triumphal arch, modelled on the arch of Septimus Severus in Rome. When people dined here, it must have been like dining in the Roman Forum itself, quite amazing. When this room was built during the 1720s, it put Norfolk in the forefront of British architectural fashion. The Roman masculinity of this triumphal arch finds an echo in the exterior of Wolsterton Hall, just a few miles away, which we know to be by Thomas Ripley. Wolsterton Hall swaggers in the landscape like a Roman governor's house. It was built for the great Walpole family, who made Ripley their chosen architect. But Wolsterton, although a masterpiece, is overlooked, and its architect remains a victim to 18th century snobberies. Ripley was a humble man. He started life as a carpenter and coffeehouse keeper. And this low origin, together with his rapid rise to fame on the coattails of the Walpoles, made him ridiculous to some of his contemporaries. When Sir John Vanbrugh, the gentleman architect, designer of Blenheim Palace, read in 1721 that Ripley was styling himself Esquire, Vanbrugh wrote in his diary that I laughed like to be shit myself. Poor old Ripley. Even Pevsner falls prey to 2 centuries of snobbishness.
Wolterton Hall, built 1727 to 41 by Thomas Ripley, a protégé of the Walpoles, a dull architect.
And Pevsner misses the Roman wonder at its heart. A staircase, but no mere staircase. This is the secret that lies at the heart of the house. Nothing quite like this had happened before in England. Here we see Ripley inserting a Renaissance courtyard, a Roman atrium, into the heart of the place. The walls are treated like external walls, windows, glazing bars, architraves. Above all is a roof to keep out the Norfolk rains. This is a glorious space. Even today, the Walpoles feel protective of their slighted family architect.
I think the top of the staircase at Wolterton is something which is so underrated, it just isn't true. We've got to go back to first principles and look at the facts. If you can produce archives that show that he did actually do a job, then it should be attributed to him rather than to someone else. It is terribly fashionable to find a suitable architect to have done a suitable job and then ascribe him to it. And once you've done that, everyone writing afterwards will copy it. Somehow you've got to break the chain, haven't you? Apart from so underestimating Wolterton, Pevsner misattributed this later wing. It is by none other than my hero, Philip Hardwick, the architect of London's monumental Euston Arch, built in 1838 and needlessly demolished in 1962. The largest Greek Doric arch ever built. This, alas, is not the Euston Arch. That is yet to be rebuilt. But this is another Doric masterpiece. This is Leatheringset Hall, once the home to the cousins Hardy family, and now an O'People's home. Now, Pevsner found this building even more confusing than Wolterton, and Pevsner didn't like to be confused. He liked his history to be orderly.
Leatheringset Hall. The portico is something of a mystery. It has 5 giant Greek Doric columns. 5 and not 4 or 6 is a blatant solecism. Mr. B. Cousins Hardy insists on a date of circa 1770. A date of 1832 would be infinitely more probable.
Because it was designed by an unknown amateur, Pevsner refused to take Leatheringset seriously. I think he rather misses the point. This building has an astonishing vigour because it's so inventive. To me, the excitement of architecture is precisely here, in buildings like this that crop up ahead of their time, unexpected and difficult to explain. But whatever his prejudices, Pevsner's breadth of vision made us aware for the first time of the range and quality of English architecture, and inspired the rescuing of old buildings. Sometimes, though, Norfolk offers a flashback to a different world. Melton Hall is one of the very finest late 17th century houses in England, but it's in an astonishing state. This is the sort of site that would have greeted Pevsner throughout his travels 30 years ago. Of course, all my instincts are to fight for such an important building to be beautifully restored. Yet, this is a rare sight today. With so much over-restoration now, robbing buildings of their character and romance, it is strangely exhilarating to see a fine house in this condition.
St. Mary, Fulmertston, disused and roofless. West tower with wide tracery in the bell openings and specially pretty sound holes with cusping and other decoration.
Death, decay, beauty, man-made tracery overwhelmed by nature, yet the mouldings are detailed, still visible, still literate. This is not a mute building. This is just the sort of site that would have inspired painters and poets in the early 19th century. It's incredible today to see a medieval building of such quality in such a collapsing, ruinous state. I know this is contradictory, but authentic decay, real rotting ruins, are one of my greatest and rarest pleasures. I know it's only a matter of time before this church collapses. It's like taking leave of an old friend for the last time. This medieval building is abandoned to its fate. Next time I pass, it may be gone. Norfolk challenges my ideas about which buildings should be protected. Not only is all architecture linked by great ideas, but all buildings face the same questions of survival.
Hunston School, built 1950 to 53. The facades are strictly symmetrical, except for the north side, where kitchens, some workshops and the water tower called for a freer arrangement. The structure is of steel, with panels of yellow brick or glass. Brick, steel beams, etc. are all exposed. The result has great crispness and a certain elegance, but perhaps a little austere for children.
Despite his prescient note of caution, Pevsner liked Hunston. This school is now listed, and rightly so. Its bold ideas make it an historic piece of architecture. It's easy to knock this building, most people do, but its radical pioneering architecture is absolutely in the spirit of Norfolk. The way the geometry is so clear and crisp, that reminds me of Hokum. Light flooding inside through all this glass. It's like Walpole St. Peter, like the great perpendicular churches of the county. The point is, though, is this the moment when architecture went in the right or the wrong direction? You've got to bear in mind, this building was designed in the late 1940s, absolutely pioneering stuff. This building's ruthless, bloody-mindedness is thrilling, but it is beset with problems. Ceilings of naked steel girders and the open staircases have had to be cased in to limit noise. So, on its own functional terms, it has proved dysfunctional. As a moment in architecture, I respect its ideals of hope and optimism. As to the generation of architects who followed, they failed to build on its promise. The last building in my journey proves that pioneering architecture does not have to be brutal or intimidating. There simply is no place like Home Place.
Home Place, Holt. Built in 1903-5 by E.S. Pryor, a most idiosyncratic house. Yet it is inventive and daring.
This is a madhouse, mad Edwardian architecture. It really knocks Lutyens off his perch. Isn't the mix of materials and details absolutely fantastic? This is an attempt to find a new architectural language. You'd never dream, would you, that this building is made out of concrete? Home Place steps boldly outside established categories, but Pevsner concedes its power. Don't mistake this for an overgrown vernacular cottage. This too is two-fingered stuff. It's where many apparently contradictory ideas meet. Pryor had a love for simple geometrical forms, which he used with wit. Here we see the building clad with local materials. Flint pebbles here dug from the ground from the very gardens which surround the house. Here, good Norfolk clay tiles, used below on edge to form this very wonderful arch. Also, Pryor used local brown stone, a cast stone, to decorate the chimneys and the wall above me. All this, you must remember, is used over concrete. Concrete strengthened by the use of chains. That was very unusual at the period. The building is tied into its setting by these long walls, and the size of the walls is emphasized by these bands of tiles. They work in perspective. Good lime mortar here, too. Beautiful board-marked concrete, the very hallmark of 20th century architecture. Occasionally a building has the power to pull you up short. This one does just that to me. Home Place makes me realise where 20th century architecture could have gone. It points in all those directions which architecture did not follow. Despite the traditional materials, traditional details, this is a modern building, not a pastiche. It was modern the day it was built. It remains, for me, still a challenge. Looking around, I'm inspired by it. This is a fantastically creative marriage of history and modernity. This landscape is England's finest canvas for man's architectural genius. Here, the big ideas that link buildings across the ages are revealed with dramatic clarity. I shall never stop exploring Norfolk.
More Travels with Pevsner next Sunday at 8. And tonight's digital picture of Britain is in the east of England in an hour. More details coming up. That's after war privations take their toll. In Heimat, next.